Welcome, everyone. We are grateful that thou hast lended thy ear to the Round Table podcast. The Knights of the Round Table intend to discuss modern issues through the eternal wisdom of the Bible and encourage others in these uncertain times. Consider following us and sharing the podcast with as many brothers in Christ as possible, and most importantly, enjoy thyselves.
Welcome, everybody, back to another episode of the Round Table Podcast. I'm joined here with Nate, and we are going to be talking about a very important subject for this. I know we're a bit late, but we're going to be talking about Christmas in general, like the origins of Christmas, whether it's pagan or if it's Christian, because there is a lot of debate. I've been researching this topic a lot, and the vast majority of videos and articles you will find talk about how it is pagan based. But if you actually look at, proof of the time, old manuscripts and documentation for people in the Middle Ages or even before then, you will find that that's, not necessarily the case. So we're going to be talking about that. So first, I want to cover, let me bring up the list here, the origins of Christmas, like the holiday. So first we'll talk about where Christmas came from. So, if you are a Christian listening to this podcast, you have probably celebrated Christmas your life. It's about the birth of Christ, and that's largely the point of Christmas. That is the big point of Christmas. But a lot of people will say how yes, of course, that is a aspect of Christmas, but it was originally a pagan holiday. Probably most people use it as an argument to say Yule, spelled Yule, and then of course like the Scandinavian term is like harder to spell. But anyway, Yule is the winter of like the Scandinavian people, like thousands of years ago. But people will claim that Yule was actually, was adopted by the Christians and made into Christmas that we know today. But though there are some aspects of Yule that are in our modern day secularized Christmas, it's not actually how Christmas got started. Because Yule fell on the 17th of December, I believed, and was never associated with the 21st. In fact, there's a old manuscript from, let's see if I can pronounce this, Hippolytus of Rome. In it's probably dated to be around 170 AD to 235 AD. And in this manuscript, it talks about I think this like philosopher or whoever he was documented how the Christians were celebrating Christmas. And that is one of the earliest sources we have for Christians celebrating Christmas specifically, especially on the 25th. Um, so, so that's a lot older than some people will date it. Because if you go to the 8th century, I think it is, let me pull up this guy's name. King Hakon Haraldsson. He was a 10th century Norwegian ruler, and he had one of his poetic eddas where people would document his life and stuff like that. And it talks about how in his reign, during his lifetime, it's when the Nordic Scandinavian celebration of Yule was first mixed with Christmas, which already shows that Christmas was already a thing. And of course, as we saw, as you can see from the manuscript, if you go and research it, it already mentions Christmas on the 25th being older in like the early 3rd century. And so Christmas didn't originate from Yule or any other of those pagan holidays. Same with Saturnalia. A lot of people say, oh, Christmas, the 25th, celebrates the birth of Saturn and all that from the Roman gods. But it was actually never associated with December 25th. In fact, very rarely in December at all. I lost the dates, but if you go and research, the date of Saturnalia, it was never on the 25th. Which brings us to the question of why do we celebrate Christmas on the 25th? After all, you don't know that Jesus was actually born on that day and all that. Nate, do you know the argument for like why it's on the 25th?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Do you know the argument of like why Christians celebrate it on the 25th?
I can't say that I do, unless you're referring to Advent, if that has anything to do with the origin of it.
I think that might have came later in the Christian church, but basically, it kind of does. But anyway, the reason why it's the 25th, a lot of people will say, oh, it's because of pagan and all that. But there was no, if you try to research it, there's not any proof of like pagan celebrations on the 25th. The 25th was chosen by the ancient Christians, the original Christians, because the Jewish people had this belief that the any prophets throughout the Bible would die on the same day that they were born or 9 months after they were born. So people believe that Jesus was born on March 25th. So if you count 9 months after that, you get December 25th. And so that's why we've always had the belief of Jesus being born on the 25th. Sure, it's not 100% accurate, but it is the only thing we have to, place a date on it. Because
Which
I
would
don't think,
be
like,
that
which would be
date
what?
of March 25th would have come from the Romans documenting births, or from just like biblical oral tradition from the Jews, or where would that have come from?
Well, March 25th. Again, like that's purely what they believe based on uh, the date in which, like, the historians. I haven't like specifically read a lot of their work because their IQ is beyond me. But basically, the original belief was March 21st is close to the time of Easter, which we celebrate the death of Jesus. No, wait, I messed that up.
No, that would be correct.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah, the death of Jesus. And so you count back 9 months from there, you get what is supposedly the birth of Jesus. And yes, it is not accurate. Chances are that he was not born on December 25th. In fact, there's some theories from people I know that are like theology degree people that are like he was more likely born somewhere in, could have been in May, like early spring. It could have been in fall, somewhere around that period of winter, or at least our winter. But that is like, though we can never truly know the exact day in which he was born, we always seen it, or at least my family has always seen it as, even if it's not the exact day he was born, it's still a day celebrating him. I mean, would you rather not have a day to celebrate him? It doesn't, it doesn't matter on the day as long as you acknowledge his birth, because it is a very important thing. And, the fate of the entire world is affected by the birth of this boy, and so it's just something that is worth celebrating to me, and of course my family and thousands of other Christians. And so yes, we acknowledge that the 25th is probably not the exact date of Jesus' birth, but why not? Why not celebrate it on that day? So that's my thoughts on it. What about you?
I mean, I would agree with that. We have Easter to celebrate his death. So logically, why not have Christmas or some other holiday to celebrate his birth? And like what you just said, they don't have documentation from back then. The Romans were pretty good historians, but seeing as Herod tried to kill Jesus and failed to do so, he wouldn't have a very good, like, the Romans wouldn't have a good frame of reference for when he was born. And so if the guy who tried to kill him like shortly after he was born didn't know and it wasn't recorded, then it makes sense that we wouldn't have an exact or even very good assessment of when he was born.
Yeah.
And there could
In
also be
fact, that's
things with like because correct me if I'm wrong, but in the Jewish culture, when you're born, you're like, there's something to do with aging where they're considered to be one when they're born. Or am I mixing that with a different culture?
I'm not sure because I mean, I have never researched it. I've never heard of that, but I
I
don't know. It could be
good.
correct.
Don't quote me on that. It may be. I know that there are some cultures that do that. I don't know if the Israelites or modern day Jews are one of those such that do that.
Yeah,
So yeah. The other
yeah.
thing though is like with all of our, or with not all, but the majority of our traditions among Christians and non-Christians, right? They did, at least to an extent, come from pagan or come from the pagan holidays that were merged with it.
Wait, can you say that again?
Okay, I'll give you an example. So you spoke about Yule, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yule was a Scandinavian holiday, or
Yeah.
Germanic, whichever term you want to use. And part of their celebration was the tree. So the Christmas tree, the origin of the Christmas tree, was merged with Christmas from Yule. And there you can also trace it back to roots of Saturnalia using uh, branches of branches of evergreens. And if you really want to go back and stretch it even further, if you go back to Egypt, back in before Jesus was born, they had a celebration then as well. It was revolved around Ra, and they used palm branches, which obviously, if you're in Egypt, you probably don't have evergreens readily available. So you have to have, they had some sort of alternative to do it. For them, it symbolized, because, it's a plant, it symbolizes regrowth, life, etc.
Yeah, yeah. And
But in
trees
the,
are a
go ahead.
trees are a universal thing in many pagan cultures and just cultures in general. But that is a another argument. The where the Christmas tree came into being, and a lot will say, like the whole Yule and stuff like that is how you have all these trees. And if you think about it, you know, you might think that that argument is logical that the Christmas tree came from one of the pagan festivals trees. But then again, if you think about it, wintertime, fir trees, pine trees are like the only trees available. And so all or most of the pagan, traditions and festivals that happened around winter, of course, would have those trees and would use those trees. So even though, there's going to be a lot of similarities. I've said this before on the podcast, pagan, civilizations were around before Christianity. And so there will always be some sort of vague similarities. Of course, oh, they use the same tree or in this type of thing or whether or not. But the fact is, just because there's a similarity doesn't mean that there is a connection between them directly. And in fact, there's several websites I looked at today that was like Christmas versus Yule in which one and stuff like that, like which one was the origin of certain types of traditions. And a lot of them will say Yule, but if you look at some of the early Christian stories, like one of the early theories of why the original Christmas tree, was in Christian culture, was actually dates back to the Middle Ages. Like that's the earliest form that we have it, where people would have plays about the birth of Jesus and would also talk about the Bible story. So they would start with Adam and Eve in the garden, and of course it was wintertime, so they only had pine trees, and they would use a pine tree in their act, in their play of Adam and Eve, where Adam and Eve take of the fruit and eat of the forbidden fruit. And so they would only have like one of those fir trees readily available because that was the only, evergreen tree that stayed green during winter. And so they would use that in their early plays in the Middle Ages. And of course, after a while, they started, decorating them, keeping them in the household, stuff like that. And sure, yes, Saturnalia and the Yule festivals do have similar things where they involve trees, but there is no early actual proof that dictates that the Christians got that idea from the pagans. In fact, there's an old story of Saint Boniface, who was a early Catholic or Orthodox church leader. I forgot which one, because both Orthodox and Catholic Church, I think, revere him as a saint, which they do with most Christians in that context. But anyway, uh, the story is that he found a bunch of people. I want to say they were doing. They were like. I want to say they were either doing some kind of sacrifice or doing something underneath like an oak tree, because the early pagans, or at least most of the Germanic tribes, they would have these things called druids. And a druid literally translates to oak seeker or oak keeper or something like that. But basically, the pagans largely revered oak as the most sacred tree. Why, I'm not entirely sure. Maybe because it is one of the best looking ones and bigger ones that grows, especially during that time and in those areas. But oak trees were revered by the Druids, and so they would do, of course, their pagany things revolving around oak trees and stuff like that. And so what St. Boniface did is that he chopped down the oak tree and then he went to a pine tree and then says, this is, uh, they like, no, wait, the way the story goes, like he cut down their sacred tree and they said that if he does that, he's going to die because you can't cut down a sacred tree or else our gods are going to kill you. And so he chops down this tree, doesn't get hurt. And so he's like, yeah, your tree is stupid because it didn't kill me and I chopped your sacred tree down. And so he pointed to like I want to say it was some kind of fir tree, pine tree, and he was like, this is like a tree that we use and that we will like we don't like associate with oak trees anymore or something like that because the oak trees was largely a symbol of pagan cults and traditions. And so he was like, okay, pine trees. But that was all St. Boniface, and that's one theory of where the early Christians got the idea of the pine tree and decorating it and stuff like that. But also, you could, a lot of people argue that, if it's, where, if it's not from the early Christians, then it was probably from pagans, these traditions. But a lot of people don't like to think about how traditions can start new. People don't like to think about the concept that people can just make up their own new traditions. Instead, people want to think about, okay, how far down the line in these pagan, traditions did this come from? And, you can make arguments around that because the pagans did a lot of stuff. But, there's not a lot of proof indicating that just because I decorate a pine tree means that I have any association with pagan tradition or cultish practices. So that's my view on it. I tend to look at, you know, I tend to be neutral about the thing because if I have some kind of conviction in my heart that it is pagan, then I don't want to be associated with that. But I don't see the Christmas tree as pagan because I've seen no direct proof. Because God made all the trees, and uh, God declared that all the trees in the ground were good, or whatever that Bible verse in Genesis says. And so you can't just claim a tree and say, "Yes, we have this tree. Our culture has claimed this tree, and you can no longer use it for any purposes, or else we're going to take credit for it." Like it's just a tree. But anyway, that's my view on it.
Yeah, another thing to note with pretty much any time you're talking about symbols is people be like, "Oh, that's a pagan symbol." Like, for anything that's natural, that's considered to be a pagan symbol, it's not pagan as much as it is the pagans chose to use it because everything was created by God. So
Exactly.
any symbol that you could argue is pagan, with certain exceptions, like for instance the Ankh symbol in Egyptian culture, that wasn't. It's not a natural shape. It's not a living thing. That was something that they made to be their symbol. And like
Yeah.
another one would be the Freemason compass. That's not something that was created by God. But in the case of, for instance, a Christmas tree, the oak tree, a lot of religions will use like even skulls to an extent. Now, admittedly, a skull is a symbol of evil. It kind of has been for a very, very long time, back to as far as is documented, to my knowledge, or at very least, if not evil, a symbol of death. But it's still a natural thing. Like, not saying that Christians you should go around and like throw skulls at people or anything and be like, it's not pagan to do that or something like that. But it's natural. So anything that's
Mhm.
natural is just the pagans, the non-Christians, chose to use that as their symbol. And so through time and culture, it began to be viewed as their symbol, their pagan symbol.
Yeah.
And it's just something to note.
Yeah, I
Another thing
totally
related
agree
to
with
the
that.
Christmas tree that at least that I've heard is right, because in the Bible the cross will be referred to as a tree. As I
Hmm.
don't know the exact verse. I know Paul references it as a tree. And
Yeah.
something I had heard in the past is that the Christmas tree is supposed to remind us of that tree, which makes me go,
Yeah.
okay, sure, but why don't we have it at Easter then? Because that would make more sense. But people will say that. I don't really know the origins of that. Is it pagan? No, but it's not necessarily like a
There are, in fact, I've
commonly
got
held belief.
Bible verses. Let's see. Yeah, I totally agree with that, when it comes to like natural stuff. Because as long as you're not worshiping the tree, as long as you're not worshiping the creation rather than the creator, then that's why God made all this creation. All the things that God created is supposed to give him glory and to point us to him and to make us recognize him. And so if there's a beautiful tree, covered in lights and stuff, I don't say, "Ooh, that's a pretty tree. I'm gonna worship that tree. I love this tree so much. I would tree." No, I look at the tree and say, "Wow, what a beautiful thing that God's created. I love God." Like that. That's the idea behind it. And same like with the nativity scenes. There's this stupid argument that's like, "Oh, the nativity scenes are kind of pagan because they're idol worship of like idols from like pagan gods and stuff like that." Like, what? It's literally a scene from the Bible. The main point of the nativity of Jesus' birth and the way that plays out, we put it into a scene, a physical scene, so that when we look at it, we remember the true point of Christmas. And we remember, the glory that is Jesus Christ and the birth of Jesus Christ. So if anybody nativity scenes are bad, then you're just, I'm sorry, but you're just uh, dumb, because the nativity scenes are the most biblical thing around Christmas time.
That kind of falls under the same
Uh,
thing as that one
so
tenant. I believe it's a Catholic tenant where you don't. Actually, no, it's not a Catholic tenant. Never mind, because they have imagery. But there's I can't think of the theological term for it, but there's a tenant that is like you're not supposed to have images of God, right? Like pictures of,
yeah,
and some people will say that pictures of Jesus paintings and artwork qualifies as that.
yeah,
To me it falls under the same thing, that it's like, sure, if you're worshiping the painting it's bad, but if you have a painting of what people, or of an artistic rendition of like a Renaissance era artist of what he thought Jesus could have looked like, unless you're worshiping it, it's art. It's as God intended it to be, assuming that
yeah,
there's nothing like blasphemous about the artwork.
yeah.
But most Renaissance era paintings you would say that that is generally not. And then like stained glass too, it's a way that, in a way, it's a method that we use to praise and glorify God.
Yeah, it's art, and art is used to give glory to God, or in some form of that. Like any form of art, God gives it as a gift to people so that they can use that to glorify God. So it's and that's what a lot of Protestants will say against the Catholic Church, is that, oh, you have all these crucifixes and images of Jesus, and that's idol worship. But if you think about it, because the whole thing of like how God has no form, and so thou shalt not have any engraven images. But the way I view it, and the way most historians see it, is that the reason that that commandment even exists is the fact of these false idols, these false physical idols and statues that people would make and then worship. But when Jesus came into the picture, much later than the Ten Commandments, you have Jesus who was made incarnate, God in a physical form that people saw and that people worshipped. So there was a physical aspect of God now that people saw and worshipped. And so if we make that into a piece of art or a statue, we are not idol worshiping. We are doing what Jesus was. Jesus was the physical representation of God. And so that argument that, even having a cross, some people say even having a cross is idol worship, which I think is really stupid. Because again, the cross represents Christ. And Christ is the incarnate, physical representation of God. And it's the one true God. So we're not worshiping the wood. We're not worshiping the metal or whatever it is. We are worshiping God, the one true God. So
I would like to
there is,
reiterate that, when just quickly, that if you having the cross in and of itself is fine. If you do have a cross in your church, and if you do like worship that cross or even associate it with like an, because we're humans, when we have things we like to associate them with things. Like you might have a ring that reminds you of something,
yeah,
with your brain will naturally associate. So if you have like a cross and you like now obviously this would be very abnormal in the church, but if you are bowing down to the cross, then that would be bad. That would be pagan and non and sinful to do so. But simply having the cross as an image, as a reminder, is fine for any Christian uh, denomination. But as long if you decide to quite literally worship the image, or rather the created rather than the creator, then that is where the line is drawn. The
Yeah,
imagery in and of itself is not evil, but what you do with the imagery is.
exactly. And it's all about what you're intending in your mind also. Like people kneel at the altar to pray and stuff like that because it's not that, oh, I'm worshiping this stage. No, you are worshiping God, and so you are taking that time to separate yourself, put yourself out of your comfort zone, and to physically kneel down to God. It is not, oh, you are worshiping this cross on top of this stage. No, I am worshiping God, and I'm stepping out of my comfort zone to go out and physically kneel before Him. And that's a big thing. Like from from an outside perspective, oh, I see these people worshiping this crucifix and this cross. No, it is a way of representing God. Because, like you said, when us humans look at things, we associate it with something. And so every time I see a cross, I think Jesus. Like like that's the automatic thing that comes into my head. And same thing with all other Christians I know, or at least most. You look at a cross or a crucifix and you think Jesus Christ, the one true God, the one true King, my Lord and Savior. You don't think, ooh, wooden cross. I'm going to worship this wooden cross. No, no. Nobody that I have ever met or heard of thinks that when they look at a cross or a crucifix. And that's just my view on it. Like that's biblically, the whole "thou shalt not have any graven images." Uh, Most believe, and all the historians I know believe that didn't apply to Jesus because, of course, Jesus wasn't even born yet, and so Jesus himself was, an anomaly to that rule, an exception because he was physical, and people saw a physical human and worshipped him like God because he was God, because he was a physical representation of God. And so that whole thing where like, oh, I don't even have a picture of Jesus in my house because it's idol worship. I see like big famous pastors online say that on Facebook. They're like, I don't even have a picture of Christ in my house because God said not to have engraven images. And I think they're just losing the point.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, you can, it's in the Bible, so it's true, but you have to be wary of the context of it. And even via time periods, because obviously, like you said earlier, that was a common practice back then, is if you were worshiping something, you would have a physical idol of it as a representation. In modern times, that's a little bit less common, we'll just say. Now, there are exceptions to that as well. Like if you're a Buddhist, then you have a nice little statue of Buddha. Or if you're a Hindu, I know that there's also a religious idol or figurine that's associated with Hinduism.
Yeah. I mean, my my aunt has always been like one of those hippie people. And so one of my aunts had a Buddha statue in her yard, and I had no idea what it was when I was a child. But then, like, I think I asked or like knew just by the look of it. It's like, oh, that's a Buddha statue. But I had no idea when I was a kid. Oh, that is a false god, because it was just, I guess a thing that's like, ooh, let's get a statue of Buddha because we're all zen and chill. And I'm like, I still don't get the point of that. It still makes no sense to me. And I'm not going to go to their house, and especially now, and like say, how dare you have a Buddha statue, because that's between them and God. uh, Obviously, if you're worshiping something that is not connected to God, that is concerning, and I will lovingly tell you about it. But that's between you and God. If you feel convicted, personally convicted, that you shouldn't have a Christmas tree, first off, I'm going to question, if you're being personally convicted. And second, if you truly are, then it probably has to do with how you view the Christmas tree in the first place. Because I have, some friends, I know some people that don't do Christmas trees. Uh, and, that's their own personal choice. But then they will say, oh, it's pagan. And for that, you need proof. And for that, yes, pagans have trees because trees are just something that's in the world. And so you would have a tree as decoration because trees look pretty. Like I like me some greenery, even indoors. I like me some plants. If I had a choice, I'd put like a little tree in my room just because it looks nice. So like, I think it's a completely invalid argument. But that's the problem. That's what I want to do. I want to kind of explain this and encourage people to research for themselves because you can't simply watch a video and expect that these people are telling the truth. Because maybe in their own eyes they are telling the truth, but you always need to do your own research. And so don't even take my word for it if you're listening at home. Go and research it for yourself and see what you can find out. Because don't it's good to have people talk to about it, but if they have no sources to back up their information, then you need to research for yourself and look for information elsewhere. So let's talk about the last thing on the list, which is Santa Claus, the big icon of Christmas. So, anything you want to share about that, Nate? Your personal views about that?
Well, in my household, nobody, me, meaning either me or my two older siblings, grew up at any point with Santa Claus being existent in our household. I think my brother tried to mess with me one year, being like, "You're getting a gift from Santa this year," and he put Santa on it. And I'm like, "Bro, what's wrong with you?" Like, I know that's not true. I've known that's not true. Keep in mind, this is like me when I was 7. So he liked to mess with me and do stuff like that. But in our household, we never grew up with it. I was never taught
Yeah.
it at all. The only thing that we did is like we would watch Christmas movies, right? Like the Santa Claus, Klaus, other ones like
Legendary
that.
movies.
Yeah, they're all great movies and fine for the season. But I don't really have a whole lot of background in that, as I was never like taught anything to believe in Santa or that he was real or anything. We never messed around with that. We never did anything related to that.
Yeah. I mean, personally, I was when I was a kid. I believed that Santa was a real thing, and so have all my siblings. Until you get to a certain age, and then we end up telling you, or you come to your own, you know, uh, consensus that like, oh, there's not this big fat man coming down my chimney, and giving me presents, because I see nothing wrong with little kids believing in Santa Claus because eventually they will grow out of it, and they will, but it's something that brings them joy, and it's not something evil because but let's get into like the origins of Santa Claus, because the original Santa Claus, a lot of people will say, oh, he's also pagan because he's Odin, who at Yule time would give presents to people and stuff like that. But the earliest evidence that we have of Santa Claus, this Odin giving people presents on Christmas, was actually, like I mentioned earlier, from the Edda of that King Hakon Haraldsson in the 10th century, when Christmas and Yule got mixed together, and so Yule started using some of our Christian stories and legends and practices, and kind of mixed it together, and that's how we get the modern interpretation of Santa Claus with the whole red coat and big white beard and all that. But the original Christian Santa uh, Santa thing was from Saint Nicholas of the Catholic Church. He was an actual Christian guy, and the story goes that there was a guy that had three daughters, and they were so poor, and they couldn't afford a dowry to get them married, so he had to, like, I think they're extremely poor and they were in need of help, or else they would be sold into slavery because there was no money and no way to get them married to give them security. So what Saint Nicholas did is that he gave all three all three daughters 3 bags of gold for their dowry payment to allow them to get married to have security. And so was that's where the legend first got started of this, of Santa Claus. Because if you look at Santa Claus, I want to say you translate into German, I think it is, and it gives you the name, Saint Nicholas. So the actual word Santa Claus comes from directly Saint Nicholas. It's no pagan thing. And like I said, much later, other pagan traditions had their own stories of like people that would come and give them presents at Christmas time. But there was a lot of cases where the pagans actually copied the Christians in some of their stuff. But everybody likes to assume that the Catholic Church or whatever is copying these pagan traditions to in you know to make the pagans want to convert to Christianity by making Christianity more familiar to them, which is the biggest argument that I hear, but there's not a whole lot of proof. In fact, there's more proof, physical, tangible evidence in records of the Catholics doing the opposite. Like I said before, with the Edda of King Haakon, or he could have been a king or a lord or something, but he was a ruler, and is stated in his time that they mixed Yule celebration with the Christmas celebration for the first time. So before then, Christmas was its own Christian religious holiday until other cultures piece that too. Which I understand. Christmas is amazing. And it's a great time of the year. It's a lot of fun. And so, yes, a lot of our modern representations of Christmas are secularized heavily, but the main roots of Christmas is Christian. And that's what a lot of people have been told not to believe, just because people don't research it for themselves. But you can, I would avoid these main things. Like, I looked at ChatGPT and asked it to give me, the history and origins of Christmas. And it gave me a whole bunch of stuff about, oh yeah, it was a pagan, and it was, the Catholic Church tried to, mix it with the pagan traditions to get people to convert and all that. But a lot of those, if you look at like the sources, they have like not any. So don't look at like these main, uh, a lot of these main websites and videos. I would recommend this guy on YouTube called Aspiring Theology. I'll leave a link in the description of this episode. But he's a really cool guy that uses a lot of like tangible facts and sources, the most I've ever seen before in videos, where he will give you, every time he gives a quote, he'll cite exactly who that quote came from and exactly what time and all of that stuff. And I recently watched his video about these Christmas traditions. In fact, his video is called Top 10 Christmas Traditions and Their Origin Stories. And it's from this YouTube channel, Aspiring Philosophy. And he's really cool. I definitely recommend watching his video. It's not that long, it's like less than 20 minutes. So I will give a link to that in the comments, and I definitely recommend looking at that for yourself, because he basically explains how logically, there's not a lot of proof to the arguments that Christmas is pagan rooted. So I definitely recommend looking that for yourself, and just don't feel guilty about celebrating Christmas, as long as you're not worshiping Santa Claus and all that stuff, and as long as you aren't worshiping the presence and having that as your priority, as long as you're taking time out of this season to really recognize the true importance of what all this represents and the true importance of Jesus Christ, then have fun. Have a great Christmas, people. So got any more thoughts, Nate?
The only other thought that I have is the St. Nicholas story that you shared is not the one that I had heard initially when I was first told that that was the origin of Santa. And admittedly, I'm sure yours is more accurate than mine because I have no source or anything other than that was what I was told by my parents.
What
The
was
story
your
that I heard, the story that I heard was that there was like a snowstorm, some or another, and there was a group of orphans that were trapped in a church, or not trapped, but they were snowed in, so they couldn't go back to the orphanage, and that Saint Nicholas brought them gifts in the form of stockings to give to them. And
I mean, I'm sure he did.
I have no idea if that's the true story. The one that you told seems like
Yeah,
much more likely to be the original, the first one that he would have done,
yeah,
and the one I've heard may or may not have been something he did later for
yeah.
Christmas, but who knows?
And maybe it was because he is the patron saint of children for both Orthodox and Catholic churches. He's the patron saint of children and of gift giving. So it makes sense for there to be multiple different stories of him helping out, orphans and other people and giving gifts because that's the type of guy that he was. And so even now he's remembered as the patron saint of children. And and that's the same thing with Santa Claus. That the whole thing he represents is bringing joy to children and giving, and that's the whole thing. People say Christmas is the season of giving, which is technically right. There's a good something that is good. There's few things in this world that you can actually celebrate that are good in my opinion, like stuff that is biblical holidays and feasts and celebrations, but Christmas especially, if it's not evil, like something like Halloween, where it's heavily pagan and there's really nothing biblical about it, then it's probably not a good idea to celebrate that. But when you have something like Christmas that has so much good in it, and so much good, when it was first created, and just what it represents still today, to this day, it still represents the nativity story of Jesus Christ and of Saint Nicholas giving, and even like to the secular world, people who are not Christians are still giving generously out of the kindness of their hearts, and it is widely just a positive time of the year. And so, you know, regardless of what you personally believe about Christmas, because you're, of course, are inclined and allowed to celebrate whatever you want to celebrate. You can choose to not celebrate Christmas. You're definitely free to do that. But in my opinion, there is really no reason not to. There's so much good involved that it's just joining in on the fun. It's positive, innocent fun, and it's something that helps us to remind us of just basic human kindness and decency. Giving rather than getting, and it's just a lot of fun. So, you know, you do you during Christmas, but keep in mind that Christmas is Christian. No other culture can try to claim it from us because Christmas is Christian. So remember that, people. And have a great Christmas, y'all. Anything else you wanna leave us with, Nick?
That's all that I got. Merry Christmas to everyone who's
All right.
listening.
All right. Yes. Amen to that. And have a great time, y'all.